Unit 4 in our Modern Latin American History class covers a lot of ground in terms of chronology, so we're looking at most of the 20th century. Also, we're going to be talking about isms. Um, by and large, what I mean by that and why I've called this unit what I've called it, 20th Century Isms, is because we'll be looking at different ideologies that shaped the types of political systems, social and economic systems that came into development during the 20th century in Latin America, many of them in opposition to, or at least in response to, the strains of neo-colonialism and scientific racism that defined the late 19th century and even the early 20th century across the region. So in the last unit, we looked at this term, scientific racism, that was based on different readings of the work of people like Charles Darwin. Herbert Spencer, of course, was one who started to apply Darwin's theories about evolutionary biology to human beings and social situations and social political situations and relationships. Um, as we've already read about, that way of thinking was hugely problematic because it gave a scientific air to different kinds of categories and labels that had been constructed by humans. So we know, for example, that race and gender are concepts that are human constructs. They mean different things in different social contexts and historical contexts. Race relations differ from time to time, place to place. Once Latin Americans started to realize this, many of them used nationalism, one of these various ideologies and isms, as a means of pushing back against these strains of neo-colonialism, which was an economic trend, and scientific racism. So, for example, nationalists across the region would focus on showing how mestizaje, how the intermixture between people of European colonial backgrounds and indigenous backgrounds and African backgrounds, how all those heritages and lineages coming together actually made for a stronger society. This was the argument of Jose Vasconcelos following the Mexican Revolution. As we'll learn a little bit more, he was the minister or the leader of the secretariat, I should say, of public education in the 1920s. So after the revolution had ended, under the Obregón administration, Vasconcelos was trying to kind of consolidate the gains, what he saw as the gains of the Mexican Revolution, by educating the Mexican population. In doing so, he came up with this idea of the cosmic race. This was a mestizo race, the idea that mestizaje has been part of Mexican history since the conquest, and that it was a positive good. It was something that strengthened the intellectual capacities and the social capacities of the Mexican people, and that people worldwide needed to recognize this. He also worked on kind of solidifying an official narrative of the Mexican Revolution and teaching that throughout Mexican schools across the countryside and in urban areas as well. So that's one example. We'll see him appear in the selection from Octavio Paz in the Wood and Alexander reader for this unit. Another of the isms that we're going to be talking about is populism. Populism is one that, like nationalism, has come back to inform current political and economic debates that we're having in the United States and nationally. Populist leadership, just in general, tends to be leadership in which a strong leader appeals to a large subsection or a large section of the electorate, of the voters, in order to kind of emotionally rile up support for his agenda or her agenda, as we'll see in the case of Evita Perón, who of course was supporting her husband Juan in his populist leadership in Argentina. But populists in Latin America tended to consolidate power even in the United States. A figure like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is known for the New Deal, for creating the kind of modern welfare state as we know it in the United States and addressing issues of poverty, um, and kind of changing this tone that the government was responsible to the people for helping ensure that people have jobs, that people are treated fairly, these kinds of things. Um, Even with all of that as his goal, Roosevelt was the only four-term president in U.S. history. So thinking about his example and how it manifested elsewhere in Latin America, figures like Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico, Getulio Vargas in Brazil. We also have Juan Perón. These are kind of the archetypical populist leaders. And so as we go through our readings this unit, we need to think about the ways that nationalism provided a room, or a space, I should say, for Latin American governments and societies to push back against foreign intervention in their economic systems and their political and social systems, but also created the terms for more authoritarian types of leadership, created the terms where social concerns were important for governments, but that only tended to work when governments had good economic standing. So we're also going to learn about, during the 1930s, during the Depression, something called ISI, or import substitute industrialization. So this essentially is the idea that because the United States, Great Britain, were in a depression and then were involved in World War II, they weren't paying as close of attention to the multinational corporations that had been very active in Latin America. This left some space for Latin American corporations to start to industrialize on their own, to take some of that financial and economic capital, or those are the same thing, financial and kind of knowledge capital, the understanding of how to create industries and grow them. They had that space free from the US and Britain, from those influences, where they could develop their own homegrown industries and try to, in that way, gain that goal that they had always sought, of being more like the United States and Britain on that cutting edge of modernization and industry. That worked as long as there wasn't a lot of interest from the global north in terms of developing economics and industry in the global south. And also it worked when these nations and governments were in a good economic position, because they could provide social services to the masses of people who needed those things while also trying to industrialize. They didn't have to necessarily come at the cost of one or the other. When world economics take a downturn, however, and these nations aren't doing so well as a whole, it's more difficult for them to continue the social services while also continuing to support industry in the ways that they had. So long story short, we'll see that some of these nations like Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, even Chile to an extent, these larger Latin American nations were able to gain stronger economic footing during the period of ISI and less intervention in their nations from the outside, while other smaller nations across the region, especially in Central America, did not benefit in that same way. Finally, we're going to think then about how this time frame that I've outlined for us in Unit 4 is bookended by two different revolutions in general. So the Mexican Revolution, which the violent phase of that revolution lasted from 1910 to 1920, was a manifestation in many ways of nationalist impulses and trying to gain control of Mexico for the Mexican people. Similarly, the Cuban Revolution in 1959, so the late 50s, and it was successful in 59, brought Fidel Castro to power. It also had the idea of getting Cuba for the Cubans. There were also a lot of aspects and ways in which Cuban revolutionaries focused on building up their local society, helping other Cubans to become literate, for example. Literacy campaigns were among the most successful things that the Cuban Revolution initially accomplished. But then we have to think about at what cost and how the other people, other nations in the region reacted to it. The Cuban Revolution also came at the height of the Cold War, this kind of global standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States, in which other nations and all foreign policy tended to be viewed through this lens of communism versus capitalism. So U.S. policymakers then had this notion that they needed to prevent the spread of communism at all costs throughout the Western Hemisphere, throughout quote-unquote our backyard. And in doing so, U.S. policymakers allowed for CIA covert operations, the most, I'll say successful, qualifiedly, of which came in Guatemala in 1954, tended to overthrow democratically elected leaders and replace them with U.S. puppets, all in the name of supporting capitalism over communism and keeping allies of the United States close to us in what we saw as our sphere of influence. So again, we'll see the situation in Guatemala, which unfortunately, after the CIA coup that replaced Jacobo Arbenz with Castillo Armas, pushed that nation into a bloody, several decade-long civil war that resulted in genocides of Mayan people in the early 80s, among many other things. That one was a horrible outcome. But also we'll see U.S. support for brutal military dictatorships across Latin America, in large part, not exclusively because of, but in large part because of that Cold War lens. So hopefully that just kind of provides a general overview into the ways that the events, themes, and issues we're going to be studying in this unit relate to each other. And hopefully that will help us to answer our central question, our guiding question, about in what ways nationalism, populism, and social revolution contributed to the development of self-determination for Latin American nations between 1900 and 1970. So again, to close with here, you'll have to think about what is meant by self-determination. Why was that so important for Latin American nations? And in what ways did they not have self-determination prior to this period of the 20th century? In what ways did even the Guatemalan Revolution, the 10 Years of Spring, that preceded the coup that I just mentioned, even during that period of time when the push was for economic benefits and gains for Guatemalans in Guatemala, so that those profits did not go to multinational corporations like United Fruit Company or to those at the top of the socioeconomic ladder. Even with those attempts to make gains, what were the limitations? And how has that shaped the modern situation that we see in Latin America and the relationship it has with the United States?